lovely to see you all. It's thanks for making time to be here today. My name's Gordon Lynch. I'm one of the professors here in religious studies at the University of Kent. I'm going to be talking. I'll just get my slides on the screen for you. So today I'm going to be talking about work that I started doing pretty much about 20 years ago, really, trying to make sense of meanings and values that people held outside of institutional religion. And we might, perhaps when we come to the Q&A later on, we might talk more about the kind of substance of that, the kind of content of those meanings and values. But what I really want to focus on today is what might look like a more kind of second order issue, but something that's really important, is about the concepts that we bring to this. How do we think about the ways in which we try to make sense of people's meanings and values, the things that shape people's lives? Because I think there's a great deal that we can learn through that process of reflecting on that. And in some ways, although a lot of my work more recently has been focused on historic institutional abuse, for most of the 20-year period, I've been on a very slow learning curve about the process of studying meaning and values in these contexts. And I wanted just to share some of the lessons of that with you today. So the questions of trying to understand the meanings and values that shape people's lives beyond institutional religion has been something that's been interesting people working within the sociology of religion, in other fields, religious education, other fields like practical theology and missiology, for a number of years. But in the sociology of religion, we can really see almost like a succession of approaches to this from the early 1970s onwards. So in the early 1970s, the sociologist Colin Campbell wrote about the idea of the cultic milieu, the idea of an emerging body of beliefs and practices like paganism and Wicca outside of institutional religion, where in, say, British society, a sort of more homogenous Christian culture was beginning to kind of fragment, and there was more space opening up for alternative ways of identifying or practicing religion beyond that. And we see really from the 1970s onwards a growing awareness amongst sociologists of religion of the need to try to find a way of focusing on things that aren't just captured by studying sort of mainstream traditional religious institutions. So late 70s, 1980s, we had the interest in new religious movements, or critiquing often the idea of them as cults, where Eileen Barker and the work of Inform at LSE were absolutely kind of pivotal to that. But then as we went into the 1990s, early 2000s, that was kind of increasingly displaced by a focus on this concept of the New Age, a set of alternative spiritual practices, often based around holistic medicine and other forms of esoteric belief, but that were put under that umbrella term New Age. And then over time, that beginning to move into an increasing focus on not just kind of more sort of niche New Age groups, but how alternative spiritual meanings were being circulated more generally through culture. And Chris Partridge's book on the Reenchantment of the West being a really good example of that, where Chris talks about the idea of occulture as a way of trying to trace a whole reservoir of sort of complex, varied, not necessarily coherent beliefs around the kind of spirit world, the supernatural, UFO culture, which are embedded not just in kind of small, esoteric, dedicated groups, but more generally in media and popular culture and popular music as well. And then as we get just looking at it earlier, in 2008, the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network being set up, a new body of work looking much more seriously and much more sustained way at forms of non-religion like atheism and humanism, but trying to chart a much more complex account of forms of meaning and value outside of institutional religion. So we've seen a kind of swathe of a succession of approaches there. And this has some kind of antecedents to it as well. So one of the most important books in the post-war period in beginning to set up this project of trying to theorize religion beyond institutional religion was a book by the German sociologist Thomas Luckmann, originally published in 1963 and then in English in 67, called The Invisible Religion. And in a context in which there was wider interest in the secularization thesis, the idea that traditional institutional forms of religion were in decline and occupying a sort of decreasingly significant role in both in public life and in personal meaning in people's lives. Thomas Luckmann was challenging the idea that secularization necessarily meant that there was a loss of meaning in the world, and was encouraging people to look at other forms of meaning, community, and value that provided religious functions for people in an increasingly de-Christianized or secularized society. And one of the things that Luckmann argued fairly briefly towards the end of the book was that what we could see in Western societies was an increasing sacralization of the individual self, the importance of the rights and freedoms and the expressions of the self. And those ideas had an even longer history behind them in sociology, going back to the work of Emil Durkheim. And you see here on the right-hand side of the screen here a contemporary drawing of the degradation of Alfred Dreyfus. So Dreyfus, the French army captain, Jewish French army captain, who was convicted of treason for passing secrets from the French military to the Germans quite fallaciously, and with it being a very evident miscarriage of justice, but that absolutely tore French society apart in the 1890s between those who wanted to defend the establishment, those associated with anti-Semitic movements who couldn't help but believe that a Jew like Dreyfus would engage in such treachery, those who wanted to uphold the rights of the individual. And Durkheim, whilst very much wanting to present himself as a neutral scientific sociologist, was very much part of the kind of Dreyfusard camp, wanting to emphasize the importance of the rights and freedoms of the individual against such miscarriages of justice. And what Durkheim, although it got theorized more in his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, I think what Durkheim learnt from the Dreyfus affair was that even in modern societies that appeared to be becoming less traditionally religious, there were still these moments of deep moral outpouring where groups would come together through demonstrations, through letter writing, through the production of pamphlets, where there would be a sense of kind of what you later call collective effervescence, of energy around a kind of sacred or moral set of symbols or principles. And that was something that Durkheim began to think more about in terms of modernity later on in his career, but he died before he developed those ideas to any great extent. But we see here there's been a long kind of interest in this in sociology that dates at least over a century. Now, I'm going to take an autobiographical turn in this talk, not because I want to be, well, hopefully not self-indulgent or lazy, but for reasons that will hopefully become clear in the final slide. And on the left-hand side here, you see a vision of what Harry Potter would have looked like if he'd indulged too much in butterbeer and never passed his wizarding A-levels. That is not actually Harry Potter. That is, in fact, me, age 21, on my graduation day, graduating in theology from Durham University. I was the product of a very traditional theological curriculum They're structured around biblical studies, systematic theology, and church history, where if you wanted to try to, ironically, a curriculum, I'm the Michael Ramsey Chair here at Kenton. It was the curriculum that Michael Ramsey had very much set in place in Durham. And in many ways, I think a lot of what I tried to do over the last 20 years has been trying to expand what we do in theology and religious studies far beyond the curriculum that I sort of inherited there. But a very important part of my life there was that I'd grown up as an evangelical Christian, become increasingly committed to that through my teens, and was still very much immersed in that culture when I was a student, though actually the fact that I used to on a Sunday morning when I walked to church often end up walking around the river in Durham instead, because I found that more uplifting than another sermon probably should have indicated to me at that time that I was on a bit of a journey already. But for various personal reasons, over the next few years, I went through a process of deconversion from evangelical Christianity, and would identify now as a humanist. And that experience of moving from what was quite a very sort of committed, cohesive set of beliefs around the world in which you're continually engaged in this struggle to try to live in a coherent way in relation to this core set of teachings and convictions and symbols and emotional states, and moving to beyond that made me increasingly curious about this central project about how we make sense of people's meaning and values beyond institutional religion. I think part of that is because that evangelical culture that I'd grown up in had always, I think, tended to think about that in quite a derogatory sense, as being the secular world as being an absence of value and an absence of belief. And I think going through that process myself made me much more want to recover a positive way of thinking about that. And I wrote this book, Losing My Religion, just to kind of chart that psychological process and social process of moving away from evangelicalism. And this was really something that was crystallizing for me in the mid to late 1990s. And there was another really helpful fellow traveller at the time called Tom Bedoin, who wrote what became a very widely circulated book called Virtual Faith. And Tom's journey away from Catholicism was mirroring my journey away from evangelicalism. And Tom, in that book, was writing about what he called the sensus infidelium, the idea that actually theologians should take seriously wisdom that they could learn from beyond the church. And I think at that point, he was still identifying more within church structures than perhaps he does now, but a growing recognition of an integrity of meaning and value beyond institutional religion that was, again, particularly being worked through media and popular culture. And so that was the project that I set myself to try to do this. And the first, what I'm going to talk you through quickly now, is a succession of waves of different approaches that I took to trying to do this project. The first wave in the early 2000s was very much to take Thomas Luckmann's functionalist definition of religion as a starting point. So to think about religion not in terms of its substantive contents around beliefs or symbols or institutions, but thinking about social phenomena as religious if they create a sense of meaning, a sense of value, a sense of community, if they bind people together in these kind of communities of ritual and meaning and practice. And so one of the, also a bit of an early midlife crisis going on involving some bleaching of hair, I'm sorry to say, as well. But one of the first things that I looked at with this was to look at club culture as a form of functional religion beyond institutional religion. And I did some work on that where I argued that there was very much a kind of shared, both a kind of strong shared emotional experience in the kind of clubs that I was looking at, which were like the kind of techno hard house clubs where people predominantly were using drugs like ecstasy, which tend to kind of create a sense of a kind of pro-social environment there. But to think about how that bound people into a kind of common ethos, a common set of narratives about kind of tolerance and acceptance, even though actually you could see the people that they didn't accept, but where there was a very strong sense of collective ethos within the group, which was also nurtured by these very intense ritual-like experiences in the club as well. Another example that I looked at around this time was lifestyle media. And just at home last weekend, we looked at an episode of Marie Kondo going into someone's house. And there is in lifestyle media that's sort of developed over the past 20 years, this kind of common redemptive narrative structure in which there's people are in some terrible mess. The external lifestyle guru, whether it's Marie Kondo or Super Nanny or whoever comes into these people's lives, and through a gradual process, often painful, often involving tears, there's a transformation at the end. So the episode we were looking at this weekend was of a couple with the husband worked 60 hours a week and the wife was trying to work part-time whilst looking after two children under 5. And it was all about a kind of redemptive narrative about how decluttering was going to help them. And actually, when you kind of looked at the wife's eyes still at the end of the episode, there was a kind of sense that however much that redemptive narrative was trying to work there, having a largely absent husband whilst trying to work and look after two toddlers was probably not entirely going to transform her life quite as much as Marie Kondo's little boxes might hope. But again, looking at that kind of whole genre of lifestyle media as another kind of redemptive narrative, quasi-religious narrative in society. Now, it was at this point that my first doubts about this whole approach began to grow, and it's partly through reading other cultural studies literature on club culture that did this. For example, Sarah Thornton's work on club cultures, or particularly Ben Malbon's work, really good book on clubbing, where he very much focuses on what he called the oceanic experience, almost mystical experience that clubbers would report, that I found with my research participants as well, particularly when they're using drugs like ecstasy in the club scene. But where Ben Malbon didn't think about that as a religious phenomenon, but as a phenomenon in which people were practicing sort of skills, practicing performance. So he used Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow, the idea that when we're sort of engrossed in a practice that sort of is using our competencies but always stretching them a bit, then that gives us a sense of a kind of, if you like, an almost emotional or existential high from that. So Ben Malbon had a way of thinking about that didn't really refer to religion at all, and used other kind of psychological or phenomenological categories. And increasingly I began to wonder whether my seeing of club culture as a kind of functional form of religion was actually just an expression of my disciplinary imaginary, whether I was bringing a set of categories that I'd learned through the study of religion and just imposing them on a social phenomenon. Other people from other disciplines would just see it differently because they're working with different concepts. So I put that to one side, and then as luck would happen, I was then commissioned to write a book called The New Spirituality by Alex Wright at IB Tauris. And Alex was very interested in this idea, which is very much sort of exemplified in David Tace's book, The Spirituality Revolution, that in Western society there was a collapse of faith in institutional religion and instead an upsurge in spirituality, a kind of interest in mysticism, in kind of nature spirituality. And this was a transformative movement that was going to completely change the face of religion in many societies. Now, I really enjoyed writing the book, The New Spirituality, on this, and I did find through some really helpful interventions by people involved in these groups that there was actually a number of common themes, common conceptual themes, ideological themes across goddess spirituality, the kind of radical social activist Judaism associated with the Tikkun magazine and Michael Lerner, sort of engaged Buddhism, or the Green Sisters movement that Sarah McFarlane Taylor wrote about, this sort of generation of post-Vatican II Catholic religious orders who've effectively embraced a kind of fusion of Catholicism and more or less effectively paganism in terms of cultivating a new kind of eco-spirituality, which is both reframing of Christian theology through a kind of more pagan, environmentally focused lens, but also through a whole set of kind of associated practices, such as kind of turning convents into organic farms. And I saw through that a number of kind of clear conceptual threads. but also realized two important things through that as well. One was that whilst this was becoming an increasingly popular narrative, that this was a kind of transformative movement across society, when you actually looked at movement, numbers of people involved with things like neo-paganism, other kind of activities that you would associate with this movement, the numbers were a tiny fraction of, say, the British population involved in those. And I became increasingly conscious that what was happening here wasn't not so much a kind of social reality as a projection of a religious, liberal religious imagination as to how a group of people who very much identified with these beliefs and with these practices saw them as kind of having a growing sort of set of shared ideas across different groups, and were perceiving this as a transformative, overwhelming movement, whereas in fact it was still relatively niche. And another book that I found incredibly helpful for that was Lee Eric Schmidt's book Restless Souls, which was a history of essentially American religious liberalism going back into the 19th century, that showed that a lot of the, although there are kind of new scientific theories of cosmology that underpin these newer movements, that a lot of these basic concerns were kind of immanent theology, something grounded in the environment, in the natural world, emphasis on kind of tolerance towards and acceptance of learning wisdom from different religious groups. All of these ideas were very much kind of rooted in a longer history of religious liberalism, in which even the idea of the new spirituality was one that was starting to be talked about around the turn of the 20th century. So even that wasn't that new. So recognizing that these concepts that appeared to be spirituality, which appeared to be a kind of descriptive term for something going on, was in fact a product of religious liberal imagination. And two really useful sociological interventions there around this, about critiquing the idea of spirituality as the useful analytical category. One was Sophie Gilliatt's raised critique of spirituality in healthcare, where Sophie was arguing that the kind of growth in interest in spirituality in nursing literature could be understood in professional terms as an attempt to carve out a particular area of specialism for a professionalizing discipline that was contrasted with the more kind of medical sort of hard science specialisms of doctors. Or Steve Sutcliffe at Edinburgh also did a brilliant paper around this, which I still don't think he's written up, which is tragic really, talking about spirituality as a placeholder concept, as something that doesn't have a kind of stable meaning, but where the term spirituality is used by different groups in different contexts for different purposes. And so what we can do is look at how people are using it, but not think that spirituality is a particularly useful kind of neutral term for analysing people's lives or social worlds. So now I was beginning, by this stage, slow learner, so we're about 10 years in now, I was beginning to get the hang of the idea that concepts have histories and concepts come from places. And one of the things that helped me think about this a bit more was a little bit of work I did with other people in the late 2000s around belief. And the category of belief is still used quite often in some forms of sociology of religion, particularly in North America, and in other kind of policy contexts and other kind of ways of thinking about contemporary society, where belief is construed in, religion is understood as what people believe. And so if we think about religion or non-religion, then if we focus on belief, then that's a kind of stable common category that we can be using. And Abby Day was very helpful in this in terms of a collaborative project initially she did with Simon Coleman, the anthropologist, which also built on her PhD. And one of the things that Abby, I think, very helpfully brought into work on the sociology of religion was the understanding that this idea of belief actually had a long history of critique around it within anthropology. So writers like Malcolm Rule and Rodney Needham had argued really since the 1970s that this category of belief was a particularly Western concept, and that many cultures around the world wouldn't actually have a comparable concept to belief at all. at this point, I was beginning to engage more with historians like John Arnold and Peter Marshall, who would argue that this idea of belief as a kind of proposition, something that people hold in their kind of heads or their minds, that's a kind of set of propositions about the world that they try to organize their way of seeing the world and their behavior in relation to in a consistent way. That again, this was a very historically specific phenomenon. John Arnold would say belief in that sense didn't really exist in the medieval world. And Peter Marshall, in his work on the Reformation, argues that it was really during the Reformation when creeds, a new generation of creeds or belief statements became increasingly important and often a matter of life and death in Western Europe in terms of what you adhered to or didn't adhere to, that this idea of the importance of propositional belief and the propositional belief within the individual came much more into the fore in Western societies than it had done before. And there have been other kind of recent sociological work by people in this country which have really helpfully problematized that propositional understanding of belief as well. So Abby Day's understanding of belief as being an expression of one's belonging to social relations, or Anna Strahan's really brilliant ethnography of a congregation in London, which showed an evangelical congregation in London, which showed that the practice of becoming a believer, organizing your life in a coherent way in relation to this set of propositional beliefs, is actually a very specific kind of religious activity, typical, say, of evangelical groups, and is also incredibly hard to carry off. That kind of coherence around belief is something that people really struggle to achieve. And evangelicals in the church that she studied have quite complex kind of sophisticated ways through repentance and seeking forgiveness for God for just dealing with the fact that that kind of coherence is something that it's very hard for human beings ever to achieve. So at this point, I had a bit of a turning point and really gave up on this whole idea of a project of trying to find overarching concepts for studying sort of really the key concept for understanding meaning and values outside of religion beyond religion. And instead, I began to recognize that there could be a whole series of different ways into this, and different writers again kind of helped me with this. So anyone who's ever sat with me in a seminar will know that Robert Orsi's book Between Heaven and Earth is my favorite ever book, and if you're looking for summer reading, I do kind of really encourage that. Orsi's a historian of 20th century American Catholicism who writes very much about the importance of relationship in religious life, and how our meanings are found through relationships and the meanings that relationships have for us, including relationships with divine figures. And I think this is something that is a kind of existential point within human lives, whether we think of lives as being religious or not religious. And I think that kind of sense of intersubjectivity that we get from Orsi's work is really important. Another very useful study published about 10 years ago was a really nicely written book called The Comfort of Things by Danny Miller. Danny Miller's the anthropologist of kind of modern cultures based at UCL. And The Comfort of Things, another really, really nice book to read, is an ethnography of a street in London where he and another researcher went into people's houses and tried to make sense of how they experienced the world through the objects that they had in their houses. And what he argues in the end of that book is that actually people construct worlds of meaning for themselves in ways that are embedded in their relationships, but also embedded in the material environments that they inhabit in their homes as well. He describes them as micro cosmologies. So attending to the ways in which our kind of material visual culture shapes our lives as well is really, really important, and the way in which that becomes a way in which meaning and value is expressed through. But another concept that I became particularly interested around this time, I'm not sure, it may have been actually the experience of working at that point at Birkbeck in central London around the time of 7/7, with one of the bombs going off on the bus just around the corner in Tavistock Square, I think, and the kind of the experience of that, and both in terms of the immediate experience of the atrocity itself, but also the way in which it was then processed through media and then eventually through memorializations, as we see with the image of Sadiq Khan at the 7/7 memorial here, made me increasingly interested in this idea of the sacred. where we think of the sacred in Durkheimian terms as being these moments of intense fusion with moral meanings and symbols. That kind of bind people together into a community of meaning and value for a period of time. And there were several things that I really found helpful about this. One was that it took us away from the idea that I'd been living with for a long time, that there was actually always a significant difference between religious and non-religious life worlds. That actually there could be forms of the sacred which are shared across those. And so, for example, I've argued in this book on the sacred that a couple of the dominant forms of the sacred over the past 2 centuries have been nationalism and humanitarianism. And you can see kind of humanitarian principles, for example, sacred commitment to humanitarian principles, both being worked out in kind of non-religious groups, but also in religious groups as well, where actually the core humanitarian values that they're holding on to are actually pretty much the same. And actually what's being expressed is a kind of religious or non-religious version of that, similarly with nationalism as well. But another thing that I found very helpful about the sacred as well is that one of the things that Robert Bellah, the American sociologist of religion, said when writing about American civil religion is that we have often a very specific Western way of thinking about religion as being something that people just adhere to one religion and one religion only. Whereas if you study Japanese culture, people, for example, move much more fluid ways, say, between Buddhist and Shinto forms of religion. And I think one of the things that's helpful about this idea of the sacred is that it shows that actually we can move in relation to multiple sacred forms within society that don't always inform us in kind of coherent ways. So I can be moved at sometimes by sacred forms of nationalism and at other times by sacred forms of humanitarianism in ways that don't necessarily kind of fit neatly together at all, but in which we maybe as we move through kind of like a sort of a solar system of different forms of the sacred, which at different times exert different kinds of gravitational pull on us. And this kind of way of thinking about the sacred also being very much taken up in an American cultural sociology by writers like Jeffrey Alexander being a key thinker on that. Even this, would you believe, turned out to be a problem, a concept with its limits and problems. And a couple of, I've been really fortunate over my career to have worked with a whole series of fantastic PhD students and early career researchers who I've learned a huge amount from. And this is just a couple of examples of this. So Ruth Sheldon, who has published her PhD, a fantastic and very difficult to do ethnographic study of student activism around Palestine, Israel at British universities, showed how this idea of sacred performances, these kind of very deeply intense moral performances, which kind of polarize people between those who are part of that sacred moral community and those who are outside, was exactly part of the dynamics of kind of antagonism between Israeli or sort of activist groups supporting Israel or Palestinian rights on university campuses, where they almost formed a kind of mirror image of each other in ways that could just generate these endless kind of deeply morally charged conflicts that sometimes spilt over even onto violence on campus. And one of the things that Ruth was interested in was what she has referred to, drawing on other anthropologists, as ordinary ethics, the idea that there could be another way of finding moral meaning in life, which is about dialogue, around complexity, around moving beyond kind of more simplistic, deeply charged, kind of sacralized performances. And this idea also came up in another PhD done by Sarah Harvey on, Sarah works at Inform at King's College London now, on the natural birth movement. And those of you who've kind of looked at media coverage of the natural birth movement will know that it can soon get into intensely morally charged debates about kind of the sort of evils of the medical model to birth and what's kind of morally essential about natural birth. And when Sarah started looking at this movement, I think our assumption was that people who got involved in natural birth, pregnant mothers, would sort of buy into those kind of very deeply charged moral binaries. what she found actually was that people were actually looking for a nicer birth, that they were quite pragmatic, that they were trying to be more ethical, they were trying to develop a kind of healthier lifestyle, be better people, and saw this as being a part of that. But when, as many of these women did, they found that natural birth techniques just weren't possible for them, or weren't available to them in the way they'd hoped for once they're on the maternity ward, that wasn't the kind of deep moral crisis that we might have assumed if they'd really become completely absorbed into that kind of very polarized moral story, that there might be birth stories that were deeply traumatic for people in terms of the kind of physical experience of that, but that sense of not being able to see through natural birth techniques wasn't experienced as a source of profound moral guilt at all. So this idea that in media, sometimes we get these deeply charged moral binaries, but people actually have a much more complex relationship to these moral meanings in their lives was a really helpful one. So, in many ways, over that period, I'd been searching for the holy grail of the right concept for studying meanings and values beyond institutional religion. And as Monty Python demonstrated, sometimes the search for the holy grail doesn't really quite get you where you hoped it would do. And certainly for me, that idea that really animated that project for me right at the start, that it would be possible to find a kind of conceptual framework, a conceptual language for making sense of how we understand meaning and value beyond institutional religion, that broke down. Even that idea of that separation of religion and non-religion kind of broke down with me increasingly, with the idea of the sacred as well. So what did I kind of learn from this whole process? And this may all be very obvious to many of you who may have saved 20 years of your life not actually going through this, but this is kind of where I got to at the end of this. The first is that a concept is like a camera lens. It actually shapes the way in which we see the world. There is, when we engage in kind of sociological, anthropological study, there's no pure view of the world. And we always perceive the world in the ways in which concepts shape and limit our expectations and our perceptions of what we see. So concepts aren't kind of neutral things. They're things that shape our perspectives in a particular way. And that if we develop that more reflexive approach to the concepts that we use, then an important part of this is to actually understand the assumptions within the concepts that we're using. So, for example, that assumption within the that's often embedded within the concept of belief, that people have these things called propositional beliefs that are the kind of core thing that they organize their lives in relation to, rather than say their close relationships. That's a kind of set of concepts there. Or I think potentially, say perhaps a little bit more about this in a minute, but the idea of worldview suggests some kind of coherence and stability in the way in which someone may perceive the world, whereas kind of the idea of encountering multiple forms of the sacred in contemporary society that have a drawing on our moral feelings might actually kind of problematize that. So becoming aware of the assumptions that are embedded in concepts is really important. But also, as that, say, the work of Peter Marshall and John Arnold was showing in relation to the category of belief, that the concepts that we use often have longer political, cultural and social histories that run through them. And sometimes when we're using these concepts, we're actually having histories think through us, if you like. We're actually sometimes unwittingly reproducing ways of seeing the world which have much, much longer histories to them, and becoming aware of that and the limitations of that, but also what we're reproducing through this work is really important. And so I guess the point I've reached now is a kind of more pragmatic view that actually there is no kind of overarching concept, overarching conceptual framework that's particularly useful, and that perhaps we think of concepts as tools for trying to understand particular contexts or particular phenomena, or that we use them in a very conscious way that's mindful of their limitations. And I suppose, I mean, maybe this will already seem like a very kind of naive question for me to ask, but I suppose one question that could be asked is, if there is no pure view, if there is no kind of clear objective or neutral standpoint that we can have on social worlds, why do we keep trying to understand them? And in some ways, I think this moves from being a question of epistemology, a question of how we know about the world, to a question of ethics. And I think it's pretty something that I've intuited for much longer, but it probably goes right back to that heart of that thing about my sense of kind of evangelical Christians misconstruing the integrity of the life worlds of people outside of evangelical Christianity. But I think increasingly in recent times as well, I've become increasingly conscious of this importance of academic work, religious education, media work, being about trying to avoid misrecognition of other people's lives, which is so easy. Misrecognition, I think, is so easy in a world that is so complex, in which we often can be tempted to draw on simplistic categories, particularly when those are part of kind of more polarized political or cultural projects. And I'm really conscious of how recent movements around both Me Too and Black Lives Matter have, for me as a white man, just made me aware of aspects of other people's experience which just aren't a part of the conversations that I would often have either with men or with other people who are white. So, for example, I found it very, very powerful hearing people seeing some of the things that women were writing about their experiences of academic conferences, experiences of sexual harassment in academic networks, in a way that was simply not something that would come often onto the radar of male colleagues within academia, but were obviously something that for a long time had been part of a kind of experience that women had shared in those groups, or more recently with Black Lives Matter. My partner does a lot of work around kind of inclusion and diversity in another institution, and just hearing some of the stories that she is told, for example, of a black manager in that institution who has a senior role in the institution and was talking with her in a lobby of one of the buildings one day, and another white member of staff walked past and instinctively showed this man his staff card because he assumed that he was the front desk security and didn't realize that he was a manager several grades above him. And I think we're in a moment where around, say, categories of ethnicity and gender, hopefully we're beginning to see greater opportunities for people like myself who've not understood a more kind of diverse range of experiences, not being confronted by those stories, are developing a greater awareness of that. And so this is the final point, which really goes back to why I've taken an autobiographical approach to this, is that I think another part of being aware of how we use concepts is taking a reflexive approach to our own personal histories. So the kind of trajectory that I took through this process is very much an expression of my life experience and background as a white man whose formative experiences were in Protestant environments. And I think if I'd grown up in a very different background, I would have taken a very different path to that. And I think perhaps issues around exclusion and power would have been right from the outset a much, much stronger theme in this work, reflecting the way in which I think from perhaps a more privileged background, it took a long time for those to become clearer to me.